As an MSP, there is no barrier to entry. None. Be a nerd. Check. Turn wrench. Check. Type in google.com and be able to use it. Check. MSP. I was asked my predictions for 2025. There will be death. When it comes to products in any form, they never rise very much above or fall very much below the maturity of the consuming entity. And the maturity of the consuming entity isn't asking the software vendor whether they give a fuck about their software design.
Welcome, everyone, to the next episode of MSP Insider. This is the show for MSPs by a former MSP, hopefully bringing you a narrative outside of what you're normally listening to, right? We are here to say the things that need to be said and, more importantly, need to be heard by MSPs that are still in the fight every day. Today, my guest, which I'm super pumped about, is Matt Lee, currently operating as the Senior Director of Security and Compliance for Pax8, more affectionately referred to as Cyber Matt. So welcome to the show, Matt. Thank you.
Man, I appreciate you. Thanks for having me on. It's awesome. I got to see a little bit of your presentation. That was pretty cool. And I really like the premise of just kind of saying the things you wish you would have known, right? Mm-hmm. I had a college student that, or a college professor that used to tell people, when you're going into cybersecurity, go ask someone in the job you think you want what sucks about their job. Mm. And you'll have a much better understanding of what you want to do in life, right?
Absolutely.
And I think what's cool about this is you're taking that tack of kind of getting in under or through. So I like it.
Yeah, it's ironic because that was sort of my father's advice when I was younger, was like, what do you think you want to do? I'll support you while you go experiment with it, right? So like, go job shadow, go do the thing, like go get in it, right? And you'll never know if you don't do it, right? Yeah, like 100%. The experience is the thing that will teach you. And after 18 years inside MSPs and now joining the vendor side of the fence, that is so true. It's the experience that is the teacher, right? And the beautiful
and you can
part
tell
about
someone has it or doesn't, right? Like you can smell it a mile away. Yeah.
Right. And the nice part is there's an element of it that's transferable to an extent, right? You still have to go through the trials and tribulations, but like if I can learn from someone else's pain, that's a much better shortcut.
Well, isn't that the definition of why we're humans and what makes us different than others? Like a dog can have another dog and teach that dog not to go on the road, but like it's not this something that gets built upon to where we understand the finer points of DC versus AC current and how it powers things around us, right? Like so humans have the ability to share knowledge. What you can't transfer, to your point, is maybe the way you feel, the experience, the thing that jaded you, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great way of putting it. Sometimes I call it being jaded. Other times it's PTSD. Sometimes it's just scar tissue.
Those are transferable statements, I think, probably. In
absolutely. Cool. So the current format of the show is that every time we do an interview, I actually finish with a question of the previous guest. Sure. That is a question that frames my first question for you, the guest of today's show. So interviewed Alex Farling. And his question for the next guest, which he guessed and he did not know who it was, is what is it about AI that MSPs should be weary of as we all look to it to solve the world's problems?
You know, gosh, thanks, Alex, for triggering me on this one. I think we always, as a human species, adopt something, let a generation go by, it kills people. We figure out how to fix it and make it more scalable so it kills the number of people we're acceptable with. We're in this phase where we haven't even gotten data security where it needs to be across the board. We haven't gotten information security where it needs to be across the board. We haven't gotten any of those things in place like they should be. Like nobody's regularly adhering to frameworks. Nobody's regularly doing beyond whatever the compliance cursory checkbox is, right? And business cases don't support it. So now we're going to take and slap on more to it. I don't know if you saw Tom Lawrence's post, but it was just a picture of, garbage in, garbage out in poop emojis, right? And it was absolutely right. Now we think AI is going to make magical unicorn poop. Yeah. No, it's still going to be poop. Like it's unfortunate, but I think the challenge is, what's the one thing MSPs should look out for? Their own lack of readiness, their own lack of capabilities and drive that are the underpinnings of those basics, and then extending that into hyper fast mistakes. When I think of AI, and I will go against Tom a little bit more in this, and is that when you think of what does AI do for us, or LLMs try to do for us, I won't say they are successful, but they try to climb up the DIKW pyramid, which is data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. At the very bottom of that pyramid is very less context. There's no complexity. It's just data feeds. It's just my heart rate or my blood pressure or my whatever it may be. Information starts to discern that's a high heart rate and that's a high blood pressure. Knowledge combines those and starts saying, hey, you probably are going through some type of an event or you need to lay off the red meat, homie. Right? So like you start getting into this where AI tries to, or LLMs and other machine learning methodologies try to raise up that DIKW pyramid. But if you give it trash, it's going to give you bad information. What if I drank a giant cup of coffee and 2 Jolt sodas beforehand? It's very possible this is not a systemic function. This is just due to a certain piece of data. So like there's this challenge of, in my mind, not only the data security front, but the data dirtiness and value that we provide and context we hope to garner, garbage in, garbage out. And the way I would test this myself is, do you know definitively what your client's data is, where it is, how it works, how it's normalized, is it sensitive, what systems does it flow through? If you don't know those things, now you're going to add a layer of fuel to the top of that. That sounds smart. So that'd be my thoughts.
Yeah. And there's a lot of places I want to go, and I think I'll dig in a few. But that last sentence, I think, is where we can help some MSPs get off the X, right? Because that last sentence was more about, you need to have all these things thought through and aware, and like you need to have it dialed in, but we have nothing as it relates to that spectrum. It's like, what do we tell that 13 employee MSP in Flyoverville, where I'm from? Like, what's the first 3 steps? They can
when it comes to that.
When it comes to that,
start with an understanding of having a knowledge of what your assets are. And this is going to be carved on my stupid tombstone. What is an asset, right?
Sure.
But there's assets that are physical, servers, workstations, mobile, portable, IoT, network devices, those type of things. But then there's assets that are software assets. The software is like the vessels that the blood flows through, that is the data, right? So first know the assets. So software, physical, and data. The next piece would be start drawing a map of where the data goes. Like, where does the data flow? Which data? Start with all the data if you need to. Like, here's the connection points. At some point, you then have to start discerning sensitivity. And that's the next piece of this really is what is it worth? Is there any PII, PHI, credit card numbers, Social Security, like stuff that I can find that are easily to search for with common systems, DLP systems, things of that nature. But then there's the other aspect of like business process. Like, what's sensitive to you? Well, to a fan manufacturer, it'd be all the fan designs and testing and things that they need for, right? Whatever it may be. And protecting witnesses, it'd be the witness data. Like, that seems like it'd be good. So I think start on that path of trying to get the easy wins in classification of where your data is. Try to get easy drawings of where the data flows, even if it's just napkin drawings of like, I use SharePoint and it connects into Practice Manager, like whatever, like just fine. Let's talk through that flow. The problem is more than that though, Jeffrey. The problem stems from what my topic's probably going to be from this as you go down this path. And it's really that when Jason Slagle and I did a talk, it was a talk called MSPs Suck, but the world without them is worse. And it was a talk we gave to GurCon 2 years ago. And it was basically just showing that this is an economic problem, man. Like, small to mid-sized businesses spend I think it was like 7% max of their money on all tech, all across the board, laptops, all of it. Like, that's an economic problem. And to get someone to sit down and do the data discovery and figure out what they actually use and walk through the processes, someone's going to have to pay for that somewhere. Where's that going to come from? It might come from the commoditization of MSPs and that being backfilling that with actual valuable questions and dig in and conversations, in my opinion. But I'll let you go next. But that's my quick answer to that one. I have a lot I could go down the path of.
No, that's great. Maybe what we'll do is we'll throw some gasoline on some of that, of what we've been talking about now, and really just kind of dig into your experience, your unique experience. And Alex had some of this too, where it's like he had 15,000 hours in figuring out how to be good at account management, right?
Sure.
Whatever your number is, it's another large number that is highly specialized at several different things, security being one of them.
Yeah.
And as you have seen sort of inside the hundreds of MSP operations, what would you say is the most dangerous delusion that you see MSPs collectively buying into right now?
Yeah. Oh, let's leave out the sales stuff. Let's leave out how they go make money and how you can make millions off of being compliance and all those things, that aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the illusion of that they can just ignore it. Right? Like I've met so many MSPs that just act like there's nothing they have to deal with and there's nothing coming for them. Everything's great. They just need to maintain their profitability. They got to focus on their KPIs. They've got to mature. I mean, even when you look at OML, are there elements that tie to security? Yeah, by the normalization function and things of that nature, yes. But like nothing specializing down that path to look at it as a risk. Everybody's telling them how to sell it. And I think that's it. That you can sell cybersecurity solutions and not have any recompense of having to be secure yourself. That exists everywhere. That doesn't just exist in MSP land.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I didn't go to a very, very popular EDR vendor was because when I met them and they asked me to come do what I do, I watched them sign into a personal laptop on their non-domain joined asset, signing into 12 different accounts in Google to go look at all of their customer stuff on an unmanaged asset, selling MDR. And I'm like, that's not how this works. I unfriend you. Like, that's not how any of this works. But yet that is what we allow in capitalism. Jeffrey, I have this theory, and it's just called the middle theory. And it just basically is my simple statement of capitalism to say that when it comes to products in any form, they never rise very much above or fall very much below the maturity of the consuming entity. And the maturity of the consuming entity isn't asking the software vendor whether they give a fuck about their software design.
Yeah.
It's not asking about whether they have secure design in place and they're doing incident response, that they follow the depth of their security controls and they don't make they're not asking. So guess what? There's no incentive to make it that way.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of where we sit today. And that doesn't stop at MSPs. MSPs think they can go sell EDR, but don't even wrestle with how would you prove that 6 years ago, my client that's medical that was required to hold systems for 7 years is going through an incident from that time that you could prove to the insurance company that you had anti-malware deployed. Do you have those records? No, we don't. Nobody's asking us for that. Right. My point is that there's this giant delusion that the world is changing just for the profit and not for the efficacy it's trying to make. We're trying to stop getting punched in the fucking face.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that gap? And so I think MSPs lie to themselves, and they have to. That's capitalism. I love us. That's what makes great things. That's why we have air conditioning, why I drive in a car, and why we didn't take 90 years to make it safe before we did it. That's the way we work.
Yeah.
But I do believe that if you look at many other examples of technology and patterns, and I've given a speech about this many times, comparing the automobile industry. First car was invented in 1897. We didn't have a seatbelt patent until 1950. And yet during that whole time, we moved from living in cities to being able to drive from living where we were going to be born, meet our girlfriend or spouse, and die, and go to church and work all within 2 miles of where we were born, to now living in a suburb and driving 10 hours across country to see Auntie T, right? Like legitimately, we're now in a position where we used a tool in technology to change our lives. People died. If you look, there's a chart called Death per Billion Miles Traveled that tries to track the automobile industry since its inception to when we started seeing normalization of that. And at the very beginning, even though there were very few cars, it was at the highest it'll ever be right then, because people were hitting each other. There were no rules. There were no road designs. There were none of that existed. And so what ended up happening is you started seeing, as time went on and a generation passed, 1897 to the 1960s or so, you started seeing Ralph Nader write things and drive the Unsafe at Any Speed book to try to talk about the auto industry just responding to the public demand. And the public's pretty immature. And so when they ask for a cool spike coming out of the dash so it looks like that nice 1950s jet, they do it. What happens if you stop into a spike? Right. So they didn't think about those things. And so in 1966, NISTA was formed under the Motor Vehicle Safety Act in the United States. And that allowed the beginning of all the rules. And if you watch the chart, it dropped until the 1980s or so, when it just leveled out off in a number that capitalism was okay with. This is how many deaths per billion miles we're okay with. If you took technology in the way we think of it today, we're still in this curve. We're at this point where there aren't rules. There's nothing that says how you have to make your software. You could get sued if it has a problem later, but like nothing makes me have design principles before I go to get a business plan and like I get a loan or investors. Like nothing says I have to do that well. That maturity is increasing. So I say all that to say this is a multifaceted problem that doesn't just stop at MSPs. It's everywhere. I think MSPs are the most ignorant to think about it because we're so we started to make cool sandcastles. Right? Like if you're an MSP, you probably started because you wanted to make tech work for someone, or you'd had another job somewhere and it was wrong. And you wanted to bring enterprise level capabilities to small business. Like I've heard all of those as the stories for why they start. Nobody said, I want to protect sandcastles from getting kicked over by jackasses every day and be the bully police. Nobody said that was their job. Right. So like there's a combination of forces all happening here, Jeffrey. Like, and those that are ahead of it and realize it are going to make those transitions. And at the same time, I'm going to add to this mix. We also have a massive difference coming where if I started a company tomorrow, there's almost zero chance I'd have a server. Almost zero. I mean, it'd be very, very low. It would only be for very, very specific line of business verticals or needs in that regard. Otherwise, I'd probably have an identity provider, whether that's Microsoft, Okta, Ping, Google, whoever it is. I would then use and consume SaaS applications, platform services, infrastructure as code, and infrastructure as a service platforms, all with that identity. And I would scale up things in ephemeral ways and very modern if I was a code producing entity. And if I wasn't, I would just be consuming things and I'd have more modern shared responsibility. I'd have SSO for all those things. I'd have a core identity. I'd have core asset management. But if I'm existing today, I don't have those things.
Yeah.
And it's haves and have nots are forming. So in addition, like, I don't know if you've ever played Angry Birds, but like, do you ever have to call in tech support for Angry Birds and be like, Angry Birds wouldn't fire up today and Angry Bird me, I couldn't flappy flap.
Right.
Very low.
Yep.
So the SaaS aspect also has very little demand from that hands-on white glove MSP experience that we came to make sandcastles with. And so now we're finding ourselves commoditized into where most of those services don't actually add value. Think about what it took to run an Exchange server, where you had to have the right structure of disks. I needed 10K and RAID 10 for this, and I needed these, and I need all that went to, I need a $20 Microsoft license, please. And would you make that business premium? What a difference. And I'm a little bit, simplifying what it takes to manage a Microsoft environment, but that becomes scriptable. That's a very lineable, exact graph API command to this one, to that one. So there's such a commodity force playing out that I feel like some of the things that we need to be doing to survive this change in what has not been done by capitalism and companies in general, we backfill some of that service offering by managing those things and helping run those things in that way, in my opinion.
Yeah. So there's maybe three things that I picked up out of that description. And one, I think, boils down to something we all deal with as service providers, period, which is expectations, right? As you looked at capitalism as an example, because I can see where that is really over the target. I feel that from an MSP perspective as like, what are the expectations of the clients that want the service, right? Like that's basically the delivery threshold that I need to meet in order to not lose client or get extra client, right? And so that makes me think also of this sort of adage that came up out of working for so many, which was like the recipe for success as an MSP seemed to be stay in business slightly longer than the last guy and suck slightly less. And like that sort of set this equilibrium of service delivery. And then the third piece, as I recall, sort of when security kind of even became something I had to deal with when I was inside MSPs.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see what your date was in your mind.
Yeah, it was, I was a technician that had to deal with the compliance officer at an end user organization, right? And so like security really wasn't a thing at all on the radar of the MSP outside of, I got to deal with compliance. Yeah. And in order to do that, then I like, okay, give me the requirements. And
what do you mean my backups need to be encrypted? Yeah, this is crazy. Exactly. I guess I can do that. Let me turn that on in Veeam.
Yeah. And this would have been, 13, 14 years probably ago, because it had been a couple years into my journey. So like, that's really where I started to see not just like one customer having a compliance person, but security and compliance then got lumped together on the client side, not the MSP side.
Yep.
And still it was like, it was hot potato with the phone call, right? Like there was only one person in the MSP that would deal with those people, and it would always bubble up to people.
And they were still only 3% of the client base. I mean, in that regard, right? Like it's still at that stage.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great call out. And the other thing I'd challenge too on MSP, and maybe I want to make sure this is clear, is when I speak about MSPs, I can only speak from the lens of MSPs serving that small to mid-sized business market, under 200 users. I will clarify that there is a MSP definition that's held by most enterprise and mid-market that speaks towards a more refined, more lineated service that is truly a race to the bottom commodity, in my opinion, that plays out. Those two have differences and similarities. I did a talk for our Fortune 100 CISOs called "Nobody Gives a Blank About Fazio." I've already used up my F quota so far this show. But nobody gives a blank about Fazio. And I was speaking towards that, and I had to speak towards MSP not equal MSP. So when we're speaking of the managed service provider in this small to mid-sized business serving entity, this is even more poignant. Because that limit of clients is one or two, not all your clients having that challenge. Whereas in that mid-market and up, you'd have everyone having some expectation of a compliance knowledge inside the organization, if that makes sense.
That same timeline had what you described as the Angry Bird experience. I used to just literally have the conversation, the talk track with customers is like, look, the consumerization of technology has changed your expectation about what your business systems can deliver, right?
As it should.
Yeah.
As absolutely. It should.
Yeah.
Like as it should.
And then that drove expectation in general, right?
Yeah. You did say something really big, which is MSPs traditionally have not done a good job of setting expectations for where we find ourselves. Here's why. Because we've just found ourselves here. Like I will say, like, there is something to be said for, and I love there's a site called Information is Beautiful, and there's a world's largest data breaches. You can just search Google, Information is Beautiful, world's largest data breaches. And it shows a very staunch difference. If you zoom down to like 2008 through 2014, 2015, it's like nothing. It's a Gario. You just see a blob there and a blob there, and you hope they don't collide. When you move to 2018, 2019, 2020 through 2024, it's filled. It's got numbers that summarize the whole totality of the human population on this earth as breach numbers, right? Like it's so massive. And so we think this came about and we have to set these expectations now. To your point, the client expects that we're doing all these things because you sold me my SentinelOne.
Yeah.
You're selling me well, what do you mean you're not mature? You don't know how to use it and you had no expectations of using it and you just sold it because it was part of your contract package. That's legit where MSPs are. Like legit in this space, right? Like maybe a little more mature. If you're more mature, just yell at me. But
in my experience, not really, because first of all, they're shiny object syndrome people. They want to tinker with the new stuff. That's fine, whatever. And like,
we love cool tech.
Then they don't create or acknowledge the implications of changing the tool every 8 months. And then they run into a scenario where this is the part that really frustrates me. So Mr. MSP or Mrs. MSP owner, like this is the part you need to stop is when you change the stack, it's not about the tool or the solution or the thing going into place if you cannot operationalize it, period. That's the thing, right?
100%.
And then you reverse engineer the timeline and you're like, well, our contract's come up for renewal and this new cool thing came out. We're going to pivot. Great. Operationalize the shit out of it first, right? Because if you have the newest, shiniest widget that's actually good at catching the thing, but it only got deployed to a quarter of your 12,000
you're probably worse
endpoints,
off.
Right?
Yeah, you probably just proved that your inability to execute created the demise of the 75% you couldn't get it rolled out to. Like anyways, get off my dang high horse on that one.
Stay on that high horse. Yeah. This is the stuff they need to think about is like, stop doing the knee-jerk airplane decisions on the way back from the coolest conference so that you get the picture.
I've said this before. I actually have an exercise I go through called the what, the how, the tool, and the proof. And it basically just says, first start with what is this safeguard asking me to accomplish in the lens of CIS? Like what? Not just the what, but the what's. For example, 5.1, account management. Have a list of your accounts. Cool, great. Active Directory. Okay, what about local admin accounts? What about accounts in every different SaaS platform you use that isn't tied to SSO? What about the local account on your cell phone? What about the? Okay, now that we've got the what about these, here's the what's. Now, how do we go about this? All right, we need to have something that can capture all of these different various things that I can update. That's what I need. And then you go, the tool, it's Excel. Got it. Excel solves this one for me. Maybe it's something else. But my point is like, it's about focusing on what am I saying I'm going to accomplish? Then focusing on what does that really mean in actual contextual language? And you may decide you can only do 50% of it right now. But now you know exactly what your defined edges are. You can set expectations. It goes back to your point, Jeffrey. And I think that as you start doing that, and then you land on a tool, well, that doesn't work. You can't be at a conference and do all of that. You have to be ready with what needs and design requirements I have that I need to meet. And then to your point, I've got to know how I'm going to execute this. That's why I do the how before the tool even. I want to know what I'm going to do. Now, the tool might change a little bit of the how.
Sure.
But the overarching how is going to be there, right? Here's what I said I've got to do to make this happen. I have to write new names of devices in this list. Oh, now I got a tool that automates it. Great. It's going to write it then. Yeah. Right. It's that kind of, that's the way I try to break that down so that you're
I love how simple that formula is and yet how complex the mental math and the mental, like the thinking work you need to do before the doing work, right? If it's I like to think of where the real value sits, even all the way back to your original pyramid. In my version of that pyramid, the real value actually sits above the peak of the pyramid as impact, right? As a result
Sure.
of all 4 layers, what's the impact we're striving for?
Sure.
And so if I think
Like
through
not
that,
dying of a heart attack, maybe
yeah,
would be
like
the first one in that
right,
example.
like what are the outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk
Yeah.
more
No
business.
tachycardia.
No,
Would be
no
the
heart
impact
attack.
if we know this. Yeah.
Yeah, and then your simple 4-part framework. I think of the value being in the space between. The way you describe that is like the real value collectively pools in the what about the what about those, with the what about the what about, like when you hit that, it was like, okay, light bulb went on for me, right? And so I know the audience really needs to again take something as simple as 4 words, a 4-column spreadsheet, to facilitate the conversation. But to me, it sounded like the real value collectively pooled in column number 2 and number 4, because proof is the other piece we were talking about.
Well, the proof is the last piece, and that is, and we'll get to that here in a second. I want to touch on something you said. The way I try to envision doing this is we would just get our security team in this case together, myself, Matt Topper, Jason Farmer, Tony Miller, but we would get together and we would just crowdsource the things we needed to do. Like when we're talking about a safeguard or talking about something we're trying to accomplish, what else could that apply to? And we would just take those and kind of like in a SWAT, if you've ever done a SWAT where you just put sticky notes up on the wall, you let everything just get up there and then you take the trash out nicely and smile and get rid of it and then take the good stuff, right? And that's that. How do you broaden a what? And CIS, if you look at CIS safeguards in general, when you talk about 10.1 for anti-malware, if you're saying I'm implementing anti-malware, everybody gets to the endpoints. Everybody goes, sure, I got my servers and my workstations. And what about cell phones? Mobile is one of the assets. What about network equipment? Are you setting up in the middle proxies that are doing inspection? What about how you're dealing with IoT? Are those segmented off and getting some form of anti-malware capabilities in line? Like when you think about the what about, you have asset classes that you can spread that across. You can kind of get into some guided help scenarios. The interesting thing is that compliance in general, proof, only asks you to give a proof of 1/nth of what that probably is breadth-wise.
Yeah.
And so people pass SOC 2s no problem with proof, not having the proof of the breadth. And so my exercise tries to get you the breadth first. And then when you come to the proof column, you're going to be universally applying that to the breadth. Because if I have already universally applied getting them in an asset inventory together, and then I automatically apply from that asset inventory to 10.1 when I'm applying 10.1 to those asset classes, and in that ask how I'm going to gather proof, those same proof chains should follow. And to your point, getting on that proof conversation, I think that is the execution that is coming to most MSPs in the next 5 years. I think most of you that are dead, you won't hear me then because you'll be dead, but most of you that die in the next 5 years will die because you can't document and you can't prove. It's one of those things where we've set it to as MSPs, as operational leaders for years. If it's not in the ticket notes.
Didn't happen.
Right. Same thing with security. If you can't prove you did it, it didn't happen. And it comes down to, we didn't approach it that way. We might have approached, let's make sure that Sentinel-1's on every machine, but did we approach being able to prove that in 5 years? Do we pull reports and put them in a folder annually or monthly to be able to show that later if we needed it? Do we do documentation as methodologies to prove we're doing what we say we're going to do? No, probably not. Most of you are not.
What you're describing to me, the thing that flashed in front of my brain was the original image, maybe not the original, but roughly the current image for the right of boom illustration, right? So it's like before the event, and after the event. Similarly, I'm now thinking about what you just described too, is like we just talked about how problematic MSPs are creating of their own operations as it sits by changing a tool and not operationalizing it as it sits, right? That's before the boom. You're saying, additionally, if I understood you correctly, is like not only do you have to have your shit straight now, because like now only prints once, right? But like you have to keep moving forward now. And so like what happens after the boom? Also, are you preparing today for ensuring that you prepared today all the way through 7 years from now at minimum?
Or whatever that is. For
whatever the requirement is. Yeah, that's a fairly profound way, at least enough for me to think about. I know I wasn't, when I was sitting in those seats, really thinking through at a daily level, 5 years,
proof
7 years,
of what I
10
had
years.
done in the past, right? And that those situations were there. We had thought about it from like trying to keep the client or giving executive summaries to make sure they knew I was doing something, but it was never around like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Client, you may have an incident that turns into something where you need to support this. Please maintain this documentation. I'm providing you with all of these things so that at some point someone can show that Sentinel-1 was in fact on and protecting that endpoint at that time when you were supposed to be. Why? If you look at the Travelers lawsuit, that was one of the only examples of a rescission of insurance for our space, was Travelers sued a company after 2 years later in 2022 from a 2020 incident, if I remember correctly, and said, hey, you didn't have MFA like you said you did in your application. We want to take the money we paid you back and give you your premiums back as if you never bought this policy. Here's your $4,000. Hand me my $3 million, please. Right? 2 years later. Well, now you have to be able to prove it.
Right.
And I would imagine the reason that settled out of court very quickly was they couldn't prove it. So I'm surmising that what most MSPs are not aware of is that they have to not only deal with the fact that there is more compliance coming, there's more regulation coming, there's more contractual obligation coming, there's more these things.
Yeah.
At the same time, you could get executed for what happened yesterday. Right? You've been selling this to people with the expectations that you're managing it or not. And it goes back to your point, Jeffrey. If you're not doing that, set those expectations. Hey, Mr. and Mrs. Client, we are simply offering ad hoc anti-malware services to you. We want to let you know that you're going to have an audit as a HIPAA entity. You might now need to be able to present this. We'd love to offer you a new service. We'd love to make our service more valuable than what it was for very simple actions. We'd love to, right? So I think that's a piece, but that's just such a tiny tip, Jeffrey, because I was asked at a conversation once. I was on stage, Henry Tim, there's about 100 MSPs in the room, and Henry in the back, like a sly little fox that he is, and I love him, asked me, Matt, what's your vision of you quitting doing what you're doing? And just to help make people understand what that is, my single vision mission that came out of my experiences with Voldemort and my loss as an MSP, for people that don't know, I lost about $3 million as an MSP. We lost $3 million or so in total economic impact by buying an MSP that was ransomed after we bought them, and all their clients were ransomed for the third time, and we bought them anyway. So I don't want to even get down that ball of worms, but it did drive down this understanding that we're all screwed here. The vendors have trash products. They have tons and tons of infrastructure, crap and tech debt they haven't dealt with. They're selling us immature products. Just like I said in my example with the MDR guy, they're all making venture capital happy, but not giving a shit about the demands because nobody's asking about security. Yeah, they went and got a SOC 2, but that's easy. In fact, almost everybody that's had a breach had a SOC 2. Doesn't help. It's not how this works. You have to be deeper in the security. And even when you have a breach, it's about limiting the blast radius and the impact of the organization, all of those things. But that said, when I was asked, my mission is to have a self-regulatory organization for technology deliverers, wherever they may sit, inside an organization, as an MSP, as a consultant, that says we have to know what we're talking about. There's no other industry in the world out there that is a professional. Doctors, lawyers. Doctors have the AMA in the United States, dentists, ADA, right? Attorneys, the Bar Association in every state. When we have CPAs, AICPA, there's a regulatory body. If I wanted to get my hair cut, I shaved my beard and we raised about $250,000 for charity 2 years ago. And I had to pay a guy $5,000 to cut my beard because he was a licensed barber in the state of Florida. But that dude had to go to a 6-week course and pass a test to cut my beard. And yet as an MSP, there is no barrier to entry. None. Be a nerd. Check. Turn wrench. Check. Type in google.com and be able to use it. Check. MSP. Check. So the problem is that my answer to Henry Tim was half of us won't be in the room. Half of us won't be in the room. If I was to be done, there would be a barrier to entry sufficient that the people that cannot operate wouldn't be here doing it. We don't let doctors say, hey, Jeffrey, you need that appendix out, brother. Listen, man, I'll do it for you. $500 a month. That's one person, one appendix. That's my monthly cost. I'm going to do that for you. Let me get the old razor blade out, brother. And you're like, yeah, man, let's do it. No, you have a regular belief that it's going to happen in a surgical facility based on the requirements in the state that you're in, that it's going to happen for the insurance to pay, that it's going to be a doctor that's licensed, that it's going to be like all of those things. There's medical malpractice. I can fire that doctor. He can go to a morbidity and mortality clinic or a session and lose his license or her license. All of that exists. But in our world, I can destroy you in seconds by being a numpty. And we haven't reconciled that. Yeah. So the thing I would say for MSPs, that's my takeaway on this is, like, your day is coming. I was asked my predictions for 2025. One of the headlines was, there will be death. I have an MSP that I serve on an ERT, or emergency response team, and they called in with a problem on an incident in their organization last year. They just told me that they're done. Their $2 million MSP has no more clients. They have no more revenue. They have no more employees. They're shutting down. And this person spent $2 million buying this business 2 years ago as a fully functioning company. And they weren't idiots. They looked just like you.
Yeah.
They looked like just like you, MSP. Every other MSP hearing me, they look just like you. And the point I'm trying to make is that when this reckoning starts happening, as it's continuing to gain its steam, some MSPs will be ahead of it. And they'll meet reasonableness. And they'll be able to tell you, hey, how else could I have solved these problems, y'all? Reasonableness doesn't mean you don't get punched in the face. It just means you use the resources at hand to continue moving forward in this situation. And I think that MSPs that do that should survive, and the ones that do not should not. And I think that attrition is going to come through subrogation and rescission and lawsuits and civil and regulatory challenges. I mean, think about what CMMC is going to do to very many MSPs in the near future that'll have to just ask that client to go to some other MSP.
Right.
Because they didn't have enough of the revenue to make sense. But that might just be the first spear tip in needing to be compliant with so many things. And so I think the challenge is that we're like hapless idiots right now because the market allowed us to be hapless idiots right now. And so going all the way back to Alex's question that triggered this is that the misconception is that you can just continue to be ignorant. No, ignorant people die too, ignorantly.
Yeah.
Right? Like, all right, I'll get off my high horse before I fall and break my neck.
Yeah, no, it's good because it's usually a good lens to pass these answers through, right? The poles on that scale is either ignorance or arrogance most of the time, and it leads
absolutely.
and channels and pulls down into that space. So I'm glad that we spent some time talking about what's coming, because although it's predictions and it's more or less like reading the tea leaves, but it's also fairly well-informed opinions too, and experience. The one thing that I watched accelerate more and more and more, let's say over the last 5 years, because I was in MSP up until 6 months ago. So for the last 4.5 years prior to that was kind of a loaded question. There's a massive consolidation in the MSP space still with private equity and VC, like all that stuff, right? Buying up the shops left and right. Everyone's sort of chasing the big ball of EBITDA by slamming it all together.
Yep.
Some people say that it's killing the entrepreneurial spirit in this industry. What's your unfiltered take on whether or not this is really healthy or harmful?
Jeffrey, can you go make a car?
I cannot make a car.
Why not?
Because I don't know how, nor do I have the materials. Or
what else would there be? Barriers to entry?
Yeah, barriers to entry,
getting
competition,
testing,
knowledge.
5 years. 5 years of making the car before you could ever sell it to make sure that it's authorized and that it'll pass and you can get through things from testing, safety, repeatability, scalability. There's a reason for that. Jeffrey, there's a reason for that. It's because if you make a bad car and it kills people, people die. That's how this works. And it disrupts travel. It disrupts commerce. It disrupts all the things that matter to us humans. I think you cannot ever avoid the pressure and the solve that capitalism does bring. And I believe that what you will find out of all the equity involvement is that we will start seeing a maturing of what is coming out of it. I'm not saying it's there today. So anybody that wants to talk about that, you're right. Sure. There's trash out there. I do believe you almost have a have and have nots in the integration and roll-ups. The ones that are rolling them up and integrating them and doing things with core centralization, scalability, like they're probably going to be fine. The ones that are buying them for pure play EBITDA multiplier difference of buying them at 3 times EBITDA, lumping them together, but doing no integrative work and then turning it into 14 to 18 times EBITDA, they're probably going to get destroyed. I did a pen test through the Hackening where one of those hyperscalers that was buying a lot of MSPs just left. We think we found 647 servers of the companies they had bought. 647 of the whole totality of all the ones we did. It was 67% of the server load. Just there. So no, they're probably fucked. So I think when you get down this path, there's a have and have nots even there. I do believe though, and as much as I talk about capitalism and somewhat of the pejorative aspects of what it drives, it always corrects. I can buy any car at almost any car lot right now, expect some degree of lemon protection. I can expect it not to kill me when I drive for the most part, right? I can understand that they'll all have fairly normalized control systems, functions I can learn easily. They have a normalization factor that comes from that. I really think this is one of those scenarios where without having some degree of that influence, the individuals just popping up will never get there. Ford would still just make weird Ford stuff whenever they wanted to, like I mean, joking aside. The other aspect I think it brings, though, is the more money that gets into it, the more it absolutely drives some of the poorer business practices to extract money out that will also play out in the same range. So I think people are right to have questions both directions. I would just say I was sitting on an airplane a few months ago, and there were these two guys in front of me chatting. And I'm such a nerd, Jeffrey, that I just don't get to talk nerdy stuff with so many people that when I do hear it, it's fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about attribute-based access controls, tying down to device posture and having that be a attribute based into ZT principles and zero trust principles. And I was like, I fucking have to be in this conversation. And so I asked the guys, I just poked up and I was like, hey man, are you guys in cybersecurity practitioners? The guy goes, no, I work for a PE firm. What do you do there? I analyze security posture for companies they're about to buy and invest in. So capitalism will correct.
Mm-hmm.
They will start hiring people to decide that posture and make a better informed risk decision based on the crap they see in front of them and ask better questions and understand better systemic impacts.
Yeah.
So I do think that there's a correction coming in that, but it's also the same death to an MSP.
Mm-hmm.
I won't buy you. Like, I just won't buy you now. You're worthless to me. No EBITDA multiplier. You're worthless to me because you can't get these things in order. That will happen. I don't know when, but it will happen.
Yeah.
That's where I think we're heading to, is it will correct. Capitalism always corrects.
Yeah, I think my experience proves true. Again, not that my experience is anything to like make explicit decisions based on, but one thing that you mentioned is true, and that is sort of like the cyclical effect of something new comes out and it sort of gets to run rampant until it kills everyone, and then it begins to course correct, right? So like if I think about that and I try to again look backwards, what can we learn from this and say, of the past cycles where things did the iterative bounces, I still think that value pools in the space in between.
Sure.
Is there anything that comes to mind from a opportunity standpoint for MSPs in one of those prior cycles that's, again, not getting any attention?
Yeah, there is, actually, I think. I wouldn't have thought of this otherwise, but if you know the story of GM, right, General Motors, they actually just kind of had, and it was shady AF, so please don't take this as an overarching business discussion. Right. But I will say they took advantage of buying companies that were struggling in various functions and then using the assets and the things they had to profit. Like GM bought a bunch of different companies, right? Like what all is under General Motors? I can't even remember, but it's a whole bunch of different brands that were like all different companies. And now GM, as a conglomerate of those, has existed and continued forward. There might be a similar path in MSP land. Some of those acquisitions you might buy are those people that don't want to learn the things they have to learn to get through today, might be willing to take a lower EBITDA multiplier as a definition instead of having to get where they need to be over this course. I do believe there'll be the ability to use similar leverage. And I don't know that's a good thing. And my advice to those companies would be start working on it now. Get better. Don't suck. Like, just learn. So like, those are the things. So like, I think, I do think that consolidation, back to your original question, I actually literally, you're kind of reading my notes. I'll just really quickly give you, nobody's gotten this yet, but this is what I'm about to write on my webpage for my 2025 predictions, which is this year is going to be the year, it says, this is the year of have and have nots. And I don't mean cybersecurity poverty line. I just mean those that choose and are choosing to move forward, and those that just sit statically and are ignorant. I think it's the year of identity. I think we start really moving into this understanding of identity centrism, device identity centrism, ZT principles. I think it's the year that threat actors are going to continue in a back and forth game with LE, with law enforcement globally. I think there will be death. That's one of my highest headlines. Was I think there'll be death. I think MSPs are ripe for taking as threat actors understand perfect victims and scale multipliers of MSPs. Like, do you know why slash and grab wasn't that bad last year? It's because when the threat actors got there, they thought they had this cool RCE, remote code execution, that allowed them to take over this machine. They didn't realize they had 10,000 machines connected inside that service they could run code on. Had they made that realization, we'd be talking about a very different outcome from slash and grab. But I think that year is coming. I think that's this year. I think there's going to be people being sued. I think clients are going to have contractual requirements they can't meet. I think you're going to have a loss of a CMMC client that goes to this other MSP that was $22,000 of your monthly revenue, and they're going to have to go, and you couldn't have gotten your way there, and you can't get there fast enough to keep the business. Right? I think if threat actors don't get you first, the contractual pieces will. I think lack of SRMs is going to be a big component of that. You don't have something saying, no, Mr. Client, you're going to keep the computers fucking online so I can patch them. You didn't say that part. And when they're not patched, it's your failure. And I think that gap, that SRM gap, is going to be huge. I think market consolidation and M&A is going to drive massive forces that do allow some scale and capabilities of this. I think those commoditization forces allow for very have and have nots experiences as well. And some that are very scalable and very profitable. And I can get deep into the business function. Whereas over here, I have to stay in the nerdy bits and the plate spinning. I just think there's a lot there. And I think the ones that do dig in, that can prove what they're doing and say they're doing, probably just do enough to survive against the other MSP, to your point. And if that plays out in every single transaction, then half of you are gone. Thanos snap is done. And we maybe move forward with something scalable that can move forward. And that's what happened in the auto industry too. And that's what happens in a lot of things as time goes. So,
yeah, no, I think that was a great way to wrap a bow on all of the different surface areas we were touching today, at least through that lens. One of the things that I want to get out of you before we let you go as well is to put someone else on the hot seat, right? So we're going to be known for asking the tough questions of other people, and they won't know them coming in blind. So what would Matt Lee ask the next guest to get?
I got it.
Go.
I got it.
Go.
What in your organization do you suck at? You know you suck at it, and you've actively chosen not to deal with it. Like, is there anything you can think of in your organization that you know you suck at? Like, I don't do graded asset inventory. I'm aware of it. We're not great with it, and we're not going to deal with it right now. What is that one thing? That'd be a fun question. I don't know who's coming up, but hopefully it'll be a fun question for them.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate that question. I'm looking forward to that answer because if nothing else is true, if you've taken nothing else away from the show today, ignorance nor arrogance are the way of the future. You just aren't going to get away with it anymore.
Yeah, start where you are and be honest with yourself. That's all you have to do. Everybody else sucks too.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, appreciate you coming on. It's been awesome. Look forward to seeing you out in the wild some more.
Yeah,
and remember, everybody, don't suck.
Or just suck a little less.
Just suck a little less than the next guy. That's the recipe for
and
success.
Less tomorrow than yesterday is the human goal.
Yeah, absolutely.